At 66, I lost 2 people in one day. My husband of 40 years didn't just leave me. He left with my best friend. There was no warning. No conversation. Just an empty house and a silence I didn't recognize. Everyone assumed I would break. That I would shrink quietly. That my life was over because I had been replaced, but here's what no one expected. 5 years later, I was sitting in a home I owned outright, running a company worth millions, while the 2 people who destroyed my marriage were barely holding their lives together. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when a woman stops believing she's too old to begin again, and my name is Elaine Parker. And this is the moment my life split in 2. People say revenge is best served cold. But I've learned something else. Success tastes even better, especially when it arrives quietly, while the people who betrayed you are still drowning in the consequences of their own choices. My name is Elaine Parker. And when I was 66 years old, my husband of 4 decades walked out of our marriage, and straight into the arms of the woman I had trusted as my closest friend. At the time, I thought my life was over. I had no idea it was just beginning. 5 years ago, I was standing in the kitchen of our modest home in Lansing, Michigan, watching a man I had built a life with pack his clothes into boxes. 40 years together reduced to suitcases, golf clubs, and a few framed photos he didn't bother to take. His destination wasn't a new apartment. It was her bed, the woman I had laughed with, traveled with, celebrated holidays with for nearly 30 years. 6 months later, I learned, through a Facebook post, that they had gotten married in a small courthouse ceremony. No warning. No conversation. Just a smiling photo and a caption about new beginnings. I stared at that screen until my vision blurred. They had no idea what was coming. Today, I'm sitting in a custom-built lakefront home, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. Not the cramped 2-bedroom house I once shared with my ex-husband, but a home I own outright. I co-founded a company now valued at over $8 million, alongside an unexpected partner, her ex-husband, and while they're still trying to hold together a marriage built on betrayal, I'm living a life I never imagined possible. This is my story. And if you've ever felt discarded, replaced, or told your best years were behind you, I need you to hear what happened next, because what broke me ended up rebuilding everything. After he left, the house didn't feel empty right away. It felt wrong. Like furniture had been moved while I wasn't looking. Like someone had taken something essential and hoped I wouldn't notice. The first week, I kept my phone close. I told myself he might call. Apologize. Explain. Say it had been a mistake. He never did. Instead, friends stopped calling too. Invitations dried up. Group chats went quiet. The woman who used to call me every morning, my best friend, had already blocked my number. Learned later that they'd been telling the same story to everyone. That I was difficult. That I was controlling. That the marriage had been over for years. It didn't matter that none of it was true. People are more comfortable believing a clean lie than an ugly truth. At night, I lay awake replaying every conversation, every memory, searching for the moment I should have seen it coming. Had I missed the signs? Had I trusted too easily? The worst part wasn't losing my husband, it was losing my sense of self. For 40 years, my life had revolved around routines that suddenly didn't exist. No one asked me what I wanted for dinner. No one complained about the thermostat. No one depended on me anymore. Even the house felt like it belonged to someone else. A month after the separation, I received an email from our bank. A joint account had been closed. No warning. No discussion. I called the branch in a panic, my hands shaking as I tried to sound calm. The representative confirmed it gently. My ex-husband had transferred his portion and removed his name. What he left behind was barely enough to cover the mortgage for a few months. That was the moment fear finally replaced heartbreak. I was 66, unemployed, and suddenly responsible for a future I had never planned to face alone, considered selling the house. Downsizing. Moving closer to family. But then I realized something painfully ironic. The people who should have been there for me were gone. And whatever came next, I would have to face it alone. I didn't meet him on purpose. In fact, I almost didn't answer the phone at all. It was a number I didn't recognize, calling late on a Thursday afternoon while I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. Something told me not to. "Hello?" I said cautiously. There was a pause on the other end, then a man cleared his throat. "Elaine," he asked. "This is Thomas Reed. I'm not sure if you remember me." I did. He was her ex-husband. The man my former best friend had left years before, long before she decided to take mine. "I'm sorry to call out of the blue," he continued, his voice steady but careful. "I heard what happened. Anne. I wanted to check in. No pity. No curiosity disguised as concern. Just a simple sentence I hadn't heard in a long time. Are you okay?" We met for coffee a few days later. Neutral ground. No expectations. Thomas looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. The kind of tired that comes from rebuilding your life after realizing the person beside you was never who you thought they were. "I guess we have similar stories," he said with a small, wry smile. We didn't talk about them much that day. Instead, we talked about work. Before my marriage, I had spent nearly 20 years in logistics and procurement, a career I quietly gave up when my husband's job took priority. Thomas, it turned out, had just sold a mid-sized distribution company and was looking for his next move. "What if we didn't let them be the final chapter?" he asked, half joking. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the idea felt impossible. I was 66. Exhausted. Scared. But for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt something else. Curiosity. We started meeting once a week. Talking through ideas. Running numbers on napkins. Revisiting skills I hadn't used in decades but never forgot. Remembered how good I was at negotiating. At solving problems. At seeing systems where others saw chaos. One afternoon, Thomas looked at me and said something that stopped me cold. "You know," he said, "they didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because you were." That night, I went home and opened my laptop. Not to check my bank balance. Not to stalk anyone's social media. But to write the outline of a business plan. I didn't know it yet, but that document was the first step toward a life none of them saw coming. We didn't announce anything. No social media posts. No dramatic declarations about new beginnings. We just started working. Thomas and I rented a small office above a closed-down print shop on the edge of town. The carpet smelled faintly of dust and old ink. The furniture was mismatched, secondhand, and uncomfortable. IT was perfect. Our idea was simple but risky, a supply chain consulting firm focused on small manufacturers, companies too big to survive chaos, but too small to afford massive firms that barely noticed them, handled operations and contracts. Thomas focused on strategy and financing. At first, no one took us seriously. During meetings, clients spoke directly to Thomas, even when I was the one answering their questions. More than once, I heard phrases like, "Is this a side project for you? Are you planning to retire soon? Do you really want to start something new at your age?" I smiled politely every time, then I corrected them. Because experience doesn't disappear just because someone stops using it for a while. Our first client came through a referral, a small automotive parts supplier drowning in delays and cost overruns. I spent 3 weeks buried in their processes, rebuilding their vendor system from the ground up. By the end of the quarter, their costs were down 18%. They signed a second contract on the spot. Word spread quietly. Not fast, but steadily. We reinvested everything we made. No salaries at first. No safety net. There were nights I went home wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, trading fragile stability for uncertain hope. But then emails started coming in. Can you help us? We heard you solve problems others ignore. We were told you don't waste time. 6 months in, we hired our first employee. A year later, we moved into a real office. The company wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It didn't rely on hype. It relied on competence, and for the first time in years, I woke up each morning not with dread, but with purpose. They had taken my marriage. They had taken my sense of belonging. But what they couldn't take, what they had underestimated completely, was my ability to build something from nothing. And this time, I was building it on my own terms. Success didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, almost cautiously, as if it wasn't sure it was welcome yet. By our second year, the company had more work than we could comfortably handle. Referrals came from places we'd never advertised. Industry contacts started using phrases like the firm everyone's talking about. I still drove the same car. Still packed my own lunch. Still double-checked every contract myself, but the numbers didn't lie. We crossed our first 7-figure year without fanfare. No champagne. No announcements. Just a silent moment between Thomas and me when we looked at the financial report and realized what we had built. Around that time, the past began knocking again. It started with a message from an old acquaintance. I ran into your ex the other day, she wrote. He doesn't look well. I didn't respond. But curiosity is human. A few weeks later, I learned the rest by accident, through the same channels that once delivered their wedding announcement. The company my ex-husband had joined after leaving me had downsized. His new position disappeared. The house he and my former best friend had rushed into buying was already on the market. Their smiles, once so confident, had faded from social media. Meanwhile, my days were full. Client meetings. Strategy sessions. New hires. Plans for expansion. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts in my office, my assistant hesitated at the door. There's a man here asking to see you, she said. He says he knows you. I knew who it was before she finished the sentence. I told her I wasn't available, not out of anger. Not out of spite. But because I finally understood something that took me decades to learn. Closure doesn't come from confronting the people who hurt you. It comes from no longer needing anything from them at all. That night, I stood on my balcony overlooking the lake, lights reflecting off the water. The air was cool, steady. I thought about the woman I had been, confused, abandoned, convinced her life had ended at 66. She would never have believed this moment was waiting for her. And the best part? I hadn't become successful to prove them wrong, had become successful because I finally stopped living for their approval. 5 years after the day my marriage ended, my life no longer looked anything like the one I had lost. The company had grown beyond anything I imagined. What started in a dusty office above a shuttered print shop was now a firm valued at just over $12 million. People called me a late bloomer. A comeback story. A miracle. I didn't correct them. Because none of that captured the truth. This wasn't luck, it wasn't revenge. And it certainly wasn't overnight. It was the result of decades of experience I had been told didn't matter anymore. My ex-husband reached out again that year. Not through friends. Not through intermediaries. Directly. He wrote that he was proud of me. That he had always known I was capable. I read the message once. Then I archived it. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer mattered. Thomas and I remained partners, professionally and in life, but our relationship was built on something very different than the one I had lost: mutual respect. Clear boundaries. And the understanding that neither of us needed to disappear for the other to succeed. Sometimes people ask me if I regret anything. I tell them the truth. I regret how long I believed my value came from being chosen. If you're listening to this and you feel discarded, replaced by someone younger, louder, or more convenient, please hear me. Your story doesn't end when someone walks away. Sometimes, that's exactly where it begins. I didn't become successful to prove them wrong. I became successful because I finally chose myself. And that choice changed everything.